that my Zoom controls and my screen controls are in the same place. Okay, I think that should be right. So what we're trying to go over now, having gone through the male reproductive system, is mainly hormones in the female reproductive system that control ovarian and uterine changes throughout the cycle. The female reproductive system is honestly more complex because of this cyclical nature and the different effects that these hormones have at different times. Okay. But first, we're going to do a brief sort of recap of the development of ova, which is sort of similar to what we saw in males on Wednesday. We're going to talk about the menstrual cycle and its different parts, as well as touching on more long-term hormonal regulation. So basically, lifetime hormonal regulation of things like puberty and menopause. So a major difference between the female reproductive system and the male reproductive system is that the female reproductive system undergoes these cycles. So there are cyclical changes in activity, the menstrual cycle. Hopefully by your age, you guys all know that. There's a cycle in the female reproductive system whereby there are restricted periods of fertility. So an egg is only present and able to be fertilized during a very limited period of time. It's then basically excreted from the body, or there are a limited number of eggs. I said what I meant to say. There are restricted periods of fertility that occur after ovulation. There's also limited gamete production total in the female reproductive system, which is also different than the male reproductive system. So the male reproductive system regenerates spermatogonia, and mature sperm can be produced, developed throughout the life cycle, but that's not true of ova. There's a limited pool established at birth, so a limited germline, and then that germline actually dies off. Okay. If we're talking about the process leading up to an ovum that can be fertilized, it looks something like this. So within an ovary, is what we're looking at. We've zoomed in at the ovaries, at the end of the uterine tubes, and zoomed in even further to see the cells inside. We can see that we have these little dots. So those little purple dots that we see are what we call follicles. So each follicle contains an ovum. The ova will develop inside the ovary. So they'll reach maturity there in the ovary. And so they have different stages, basically. They start out as something called a primordial follicle. What a primordial follicle is, very simply, is there's an oocyte in the middle. So that's basically what becomes the egg part, right? And then there are follicle cells around it, so kind of like an epithelia. There's this layer of cells on the outside are the granulosa cells. Each follicle can develop in response to hormones. And the hormones are basically acting on the granulosa cells, so that layer of cells surrounding the oocyte. The hormones that are affecting the granulosa cells are estrogen and FSH. And the granulosa cells will secrete chemical messengers in response to this. So basically, like, these hormones target the outer layer, and then that outer layer affects the oocyte and the stuff inside the follicle. One of the things that the granulosa cells can do is secrete inhibin. So we saw inhibin on Wednesday in the male reproductive system. It works pretty much the same in the female reproductive system. It provides a negative feedback loop that shuts down FSH secretion. The granulosa cell's job overall is kind of twofold. So one is that they're going to transport nutrients. So they have gap junctions between them, and they're going to get nutrients flowing from the outer environment in to nourish the growing oocyte. They're also going to secrete estrogens and progesterone. So we can see that estrogen acts on granulosa cells, and they also produce estrogen. They don't produce FSH, which does act on them, but they do secrete progesterone. This is a brief rundown of the various things that are secreted by the Sertoli cells in males versus the granulosa cells in females, because they're kind of complementary, so they're similar to each other. As ova develop, they go through a series of stages, and those stages start during fetal development and continue all the way through fertilization. The process of creating the ova is called oogenesis. So our kind of primordial cells here, the cells we start with, are called oogonia, just like we started with spermatogonia in males. And the final cells that we're trying to get to are called ova. That's a plural of ovum. So ovum down here, we can see is what we're getting after fertilization. So in females, the number of oogonia is fixed prior to birth. So that's different than in the male reproductive system, where we have basically an unlimited number of spermatogonia. Because in males, spermatogonia keep doing mitosis. That's not happening anymore in females after birth. Meiosis actually starts in the fetus. So we can see that mitosis made some more oogonia here during fetal development, but that's not continuing after birth. What does happen is that some of those oogonia turn into primary oocytes. And primary oocytes actually start to go right into the first part of meiosis 1, and then they get stuck. So there's this thing called meiotic arrest. So meiosis is going to stop in prophase 1 of meiosis 1. Prior to ovulation, the developing ovum is going to continue with meiosis 1. So this is occurring during and right just before ovulation. The cell will only go through meiosis 2, basically after ovulation has occurred, and will only completely complete it after fertilization. A thing that we can note about the development of ova versus the development of sperm is also that because egg cells, right, have a different role in sexual reproduction, so they're providing like all the organelles and stuff for our embryo and then our fetus, we can see that instead of producing a lot of ova from one of our oogonia, we keep shuffling all the cytoplasm into just one of our daughter cells that we get after meiosis 1 and 2. So we can see that our oocyte is actually quite big compared to our sperm cells. So the menstrual cycle is related to the development of the ova. It's also related to changes in the uterus. So over time, there are a number of changes to the ovary and the uterus that occur kind of in conjunction. So we consider these two sub-cycles, basically, an ovarian cycle and a uterine cycle. The ovarian cycle itself has two phases within it, the follicular phase and the luteal phase, which we'll go over in a second. But all of this cycling is basically going to be caused by changes to concentrations in estrogen and progesterone. So starting with the ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle has two parts. It's got the follicular phase, where we're developing follicles, and then we have the luteal phase. The follicular phase starts first, and whenever we're talking about a menstrual cycle, we're starting from menstruation. So starting at the beginning of menstruation, all the way up to ovulation, we're talking about the follicular phase, and that lasts approximately 14 days. The average menstrual cycle is about 28 days. So it's like the first half. Okay, so we move from menstruation to ovulation, and then we enter the luteal phase. The luteal phase lasts from ovulation through the rest of the menstrual cycle up until menstruation, so up until the period starts. This also lasts about 14 days. So we're going to look through each of these phases in a little more detail. So for the follicular phase, the way it basically starts is that FSH and estrogens are going to be stimulating the growth and development of follicles. So if you were to look at an ovary, follicles are going to be at all sorts of different stages of development if you're looking throughout the ovarian cycle. A couple of the many follicles that are in the ovary, because remember they're all there starting at birth, are going to end up developing in response to FSH and estrogen. So some of these follicles are basically going to be more receptive than others to these hormones. The follicles that are going to start developing, basically the first thing that happens is that the oocyte grows. So let's look over at the diagram. So here we see one. So number one here is our primordial follicle, right? And then at number two, we can see that our oocyte is kind of like this dark blue stuff in the center. It's growing, and the granulosa cells, which are the cells along the outside, are proliferating. So there are more granulosa cells now. So remember, those are our targets of hormones. They're also producing estrogen and progesterone. Okay. Moving to 3, we have a zona pellucida and the antrum forming. So the zona pellucida is just another space, basically. The antrum here is this reservoir in blue. Now, up until this point, we've had a couple follicles developing, not just one. As we move forward, we're going to have just the dominant follicle continuing to develop. So one of these follicles is going to be basically more receptive to the hormones. So the follicles that are less receptive regress, kind of die off, and one follicle is going to continue, or in some cases, 2, but that's rare, right? Usually 1. In the dominant follicle, the corona radiata develops. Okay? So we have a layer along the outside, and once it's mature, we call it a Graafian follicle. So all of that is the follicular phase. So starting at menstruation up until day 14. Around day 14, ovulation occurs. So this Graafian follicle basically bursts, and that oocyte inside comes out. So that's why we see 5 here, and that same image here at the beginning of the luteal phase. So, to lead us into the luteal phase, a couple things have to happen at the end of the follicular phase. One thing that happens is that GnRH surges. So that's one of our hormones coming from our hypothalamus. It surges and it causes LH, which is luteinizing hormone, to surge. So luteinizing hormone starts the luteal phase. So this luteinizing hormone surge triggers ovulation and the development of this structure called the corpus luteum. Okay. The corpus luteum is basically still our ruptured follicle. What happens to this ruptured follicle is that it turns into a gland. So that's why we see this follicle, all its different colors, right? We got our corona radiata, we got our antrum. It turns into a gland called the corpus luteum at the beginning of the luteal phase. The corpus luteum also secretes hormones, right? Just like our granulosa cells, right? The corpus luteum is going to be secreting estrogens and progesterone. The corpus luteum reaches its maximum of activity in about 10 days. So it doesn't stick around like your whole life, right? This is a cycle. So it lasts for about 10 days and then degenerates. We call this degeneration luteolysis. During luteolysis, because the corpus luteum is basically dying off, we're going to see decreased levels of estrogen and progesterone because that's what the corpus luteum was making. As these decrease, this is going to cause menstruation. Menstruation is the end of the luteal phase and the beginning of the follicular phase. So at this point, we would start over again. Right? This is a cycle. So that's both the ending point and the beginning point. However, if the oocyte is fertilized, so here we saw we gave off our oocyte, right? What we're tracking is the ruptured follicle. The oocyte has moved basically into the uterine tubes. If that oocyte gets fertilized, degeneration doesn't occur, and we're going to see a different process leading to pregnancy and birth. So here we just see a zoomed in sort of version of those diagrams we were looking at before. So here we have our follicle cells. So we've got our primordial follicles. We then see the primary follicle as it starts to develop. You can see our oocyte. You can see that there's now another space around it, the zona pellucida. We have our granulosa cells surrounding it. As it grows, it develops something called theca cells around it. That's just another layer. Secondary follicle has this antrum. So this is like a fluid-filled space that's eventually going to kind of like propel the oocyte. We have our mature Graafian follicle that's ready to go into ovulation and our next phase. So we can see that at ovulation, this antrum burst, and the fluid inside the antrum pushed our oocyte out. The oocyte is surrounded by the corona radiata. However, that Graafian follicle stays inside the ovary, and this ruptured follicle becomes a gland called the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum is giving off hormones, but eventually degenerates after about 10 days. And then the cycle begins over again with new follicle cells at the same time as menstruation is occurring. So running kind of in conjunction with the ovarian cycle, there's also a uterine cycle. So we have development of basically the uterine lining throughout the menstrual cycle. It's broken into phases as well, 3 of them this time. So we have our menstrual phase, our proliferative phase, and our secretory phase. And they correspond to what's going on in the ovaries. So during the follicular phase, that's when the menstrual phase and the proliferative phase of the uterus are happening. So the menstrual phase is going to be actually menstruation. So the first 5 days of the follicular phase are menstruation, because we remember that the follicular phase begins on day 1 of menstruation. And then the uterus continues to have some changes in the proliferative phase. We'll go through those in a second. Occur up to day 14 before we enter the secretory phase, which runs in parallel with the luteal phase. So days 15 through 28, approximately, right? All these numbers are just averages. So looking at the menstrual phase in more detail, what the menstrual phase is, pretty basically, is the shedding of the uterine lining. So your uterus has a lining in the center. And during the menstrual phase, the blood flow to tissue decreases. The tissues die off, and then they flow into the vagina, right? They fall off the uterine walls and flow out. This causes the menstrual flow. So the menstrual flow really is that inner layer of the uterus, right? So here we can see the endometrium. So this is like in the wall of the uterus. We can see a lining, we can see blood vessels and glands in the uterus. So menstruation is under hormonal control. It's triggered by the decrease in levels of estrogens and progesterone. Remember that during the luteal phase, at the end of the luteal phase, as the corpus luteum degenerates, it basically stops giving off estrogens and progesterone, and that was what was creating levels of those estrogens and progesterone. So as it dies off, levels of estrogen and progesterone in the plasma decrease, and this is going to trigger menstruation in the uterus. Next, we're moving into the proliferative phase. So during the proliferative phase, menstruation has already occurred, that lining is gone, right? The uterus is now going to prepare hopefully for fertilization, right? Uterus is hopeful. You may or may not be, right? Okay. So in order to prepare for a fertilized ovum, it's going to do a couple things. First, it's going to develop a lining on the endometrium. So the endometrium is the wall of the uterus. The lining is what forms in preparation for the fertilized ovum and then sloughs off in the case of menstruation. The endometrial layer also grows, so it's growing thicker. The glands of the endometrium get larger. Even the smooth muscle layer of the uterus thickens, and the cervical glands start to secrete mucus. There's a lot going on during the proliferative phase. The proliferative phase, just like all our other phases, is under hormonal control, specifically under the hormonal control of estrogen. So estrogens are stimulating the development, basically mostly of the uterine lining, as well as these other changes. Finally, during the secretory phase, the endometrium is prepared for implantation. So the big thing that's happening during the secretory phase is that number one, we're increasing blood supply to the endometrium. Number two, we're secreting a bunch of stuff. That's why it's called the secretory phase, right? So we're secreting stuff from glands inside the uterus. So we can see these endometrial glands here. So the endometrial glands are going to get bigger and they're going to secrete glycogen-rich fluids. So glycogen, right, is a polysaccharide, right? It's a carbohydrate. So it will feed growing cells if implantation occurs. Cervical secretions, separate from the uterus, right? The cervix is below the uterus. The cervical secretions become more sticky, forming a plug, kind of blocking the uterus off. So here's just a zoomed in picture of the relationship between the follicular phase, the luteal phase, and the uterine phases, the three phases: menstruation, proliferation, and secretion. Okay. So we have follicular phase corresponding to menstrual and proliferative phase. So during menstruation, we have the lining of the endometrium clearing off, and during the proliferative phase, it's going to start to rebuild. Then during the luteal phase, we start secreting a bunch of stuff and increasing blood flow to the endometrium, preparing for possible implantation. Okay. So during the menstrual cycle, there are a lot of hormonal changes. These different hormonal changes and these different sort of surges and dying off of the different hormones are part of what control the shifts between the phases. It's not like your uterus or your ovary has a stopwatch and just switches over on day 14. It's in response to these hormones. Okay, so we should think about where these different hormones are coming from and also what their levels are during different parts of the cycle. So just an orientation to the figure on your right. So here at the top, we're looking at levels of estrogen and progesterone. Below, we're looking at levels of LH and FSH, so from the anterior pituitary gland. And then below, we have how these graphs correspond to the ovarian cycle, the follicular phase and the luteal phase, and the uterine cycle, so the menstrual, proliferative, and secretory phases. Okay. So as we're thinking about these hormones, estrogen is first being secreted from the follicles. So estrogen is being secreted like by those granulosa cells in the developing follicles. And then after that, during the luteal phase, it's going to be secreted by the corpus luteum. Progesterone is really mainly secreted by the corpus luteum. So we can see that it's low to non-existent early on. Then in the luteal phase, it's much higher. LH and FSH aren't secreted locally. They're secreted from the anterior pituitary gland. So they're coming up, down from your brain, basically. but we can see that they have a marked surge right before the luteal phase. And there's a relationship as well between estrogen and progesterone and LH and FSH. So estrogens and progesterone can inhibit LH and FSH secretion. So you can see that estrogen actually is starting to die off a little bit before we see a surge in LH and FSH. So we have a couple of flowcharts now corresponding to different parts of the ovarian cycle. So starting with what's going on during the early to mid follicular phase. So basically during menstruation and then during that beginning of the developing follicle. So what's happening in order to create oogenesis and follicular development, right? That's the goal of this flow chart. We're in the early to mid follicular phase. So what we're trying to do is get towards like a mature egg eventually. And ultimately the signal for this is coming from the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is secreting GnRH. Now, GnRH is a tropic hormone, so it acts on another gland to create other hormones. Specifically, the target of GnRH is the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary's job, among other things, but regarding the reproductive system, is to secrete FSH and LH. So it does that in response to this GnRH, or gonadotropin releasing hormone, right? Okay. Let's follow FSH first. So FSH from the anterior pituitary acts on the granulosa cells. One of the things that the granulosa cells are doing is nourishing oogenesis and causing follicular development. Another thing that they do is secrete inhibin. We've seen inhibin before as we looked at the development of sperm cells. So inhibin actually has a negative feedback loop. Inhibin secreted by the granulosa cells is going to suppress FSH secretion. So FSH, as it reaches the granulosa cells, basically starts to turn itself off. Okay. Now following the right-hand side of this diagram, the pathway following from luteinizing hormone. So LH is secreted by the anterior pituitary and acts on the theca cells. So the theca cells are just an outer layer on the developing follicle. The theca cells actually secrete androgen. Androgen we think of as male hormones, but in the follicle itself, in the granulosa cells, androgen is modified using enzymes into estrogen. Okay. So the androgens eventually create estrogen secretion in the granulosa cells, which increases plasma estrogen, which has a negative feedback loop on the anterior pituitary's secretion of FSH and luteinizing hormone. Okay. So basically the hypothalamus is secreting GnRH, and through these pathways, it's causing oogenesis, so causing the follicles to develop, but also turning off the anterior pituitary, right? So it's going to turn on the signal to start to develop follicles, but we only want a couple follicles to develop, and we don't want to just be permanently developing follicle day after day after day. We want to just kick off this process and then turn it off so that the rest of the cycle can occur. So here we see the actions of a couple estrogens, and we saw that we have some estrogen secretion happening during this phase. We'll get back to those in a second. Moving further though, through our basically ovarian cycle and the effect of hormones, let's move to the late follicular phase. Okay, so during the late follicular phase, there are rising levels of estrogen. So flipping back, all right, there were rising levels of estrogen through the follicular phase. In the late follicular phase, they're getting high. And these rising levels of estrogen actually change how hormones affect the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So we had the hypothalamus creating GnRH, causing the anterior pituitary to create LH and FSH. We saw that during the early to mid follicular phase, we had a couple of negative feedback loops here on the anterior pituitary. But in the late follicular phase, we then have a positive feedback loop. So it switches when we have these higher levels of estrogen. It kind of switches how the receptors on the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary are reacting. Okay? So during the late follicular phase, estrogen secreted by the granulosa cells causes a positive feedback loop. When we get to the slides on pregnancy, this will become more relevant, but here's what progesterone is doing. Okay. Before we get to that, let's talk about the luteal phase. Okay. So the luteal phase still have some GnRH secretion. What's happening with the luteal phase is, right, that we're having ovulation at the very beginning, and then we're converting our follicle into a gland, which works for 10 days and then dies off. Okay. So we have FSH and LH being secreted by the anterior pituitary and acting on the corpus luteum, which is this gland we've created out of our burst follicle. So the corpus luteum produces inhibin, which we know has a negative feedback loop on FSH. It also secretes progesterone, which has a negative feedback loop on FSH and LH, so on the anterior pituitary generally. And it's creating rising levels of estrogen. Okay, so the corpus luteum is creating estrogen. Okay. So in addition to kind of controlling these cycles, hormones do, specifically estrogen, do affect life cycle changes in the female reproductive system. So estrogen is really responsible for secondary sex characteristics. So basically kind of like visible or sensible changes that we associate with females. So estrogen causes the widening of hips, the deposition of fat in breasts, hips, and buttocks, so expanding these areas, changing the shoulder to hip ratio, also causes changes in skin oil, body hair, and growth. So people, when they hit puberty, right, get taller. That's because estrogen has an effect on the growth of bones. During reproductive years, estrogen levels remain high, basically to maintain these structures, so to maintain these secondary sex characteristics. And when estrogen levels drop off, we're not going to see really these sex characteristics being maintained in the same way. Which is one reason, right, that osteoporosis is a problem in older women. Okay. So as estrogen levels decrease, some of these secondary sex characteristics are dying off, right? So like the bone growth, for example. There are also sort of experiential changes like hot flashes, so feelings of temperature regulation change in response to a drop off of estrogen. There's also increased risk of some diseases like heart disease and osteoporosis. Okay. So finally, we're going to talk for a couple minutes about fertilization, implantation, and embryonic development. Okay. Starting out with where this is all happening. So fertilization usually takes place in the uterine tube. So remember, we have our ovaries, which lead into the uterine tubes, which lead into the uterus, into the cervix, into the vagina. So in order for fertilization to happen, you need to get sperm up into the uterine tube. Sperm have to be introduced into the female reproductive tract within about 5 days before ovulation. And that's because sperm remain viable for 5 days. So they like basically don't die off for 5 days. and they have to be there in order to fertilize an egg. So 5 days before, they could live for 5 days and then have ovulation occur on day 5. If it's longer than that, they'll probably be dead by the time ovulation occurs. The oocyte, the egg, is not viable for as long, only about 12 to 24 hours. So that's quite a brief period. So this is really more dependent on sperm being there when the egg is released. So initially, at the beginning, sperm are incapable of fertilization. So there need to be some changes made to the sperm in order for fertilization to occur, in order for it to basically be able to break open an egg, get in there. We'll talk about that on the next slide, I believe. So let's focus on the egg cell first. So when ovulation occurs, so remember that that's basically at the beginning of the luteal phase, fluid movement causes the oocyte to get released, and they enter the fimbriae of the uterine tube. So surrounding the ovary, we don't have exactly a hole leading from the ovary into the uterine tube like we see in a lot of our other tubes, right? Like it's not a mouth. The fimbriae are these kind of hands surrounding the ovary, ready to catch the egg. So we see the antrum bursting, and there's fluid movement that causes the oocyte to move into the fimbriae from the ovary. At that point, there are some peristaltic contractions, so some slow muscle contractions move the oocyte toward the uterus. And the slide makes it sound like it's for a long time. This only occurs for a couple minutes, right? So several minutes, right? After that, though, the cilia are going to be moving the oocyte down towards the uterus for a couple days. So there are cilia, so more little fingers along the uterine tube, moving the oocyte. The whole trip from the ovary into the uterus takes about 4 days. Now, the oocyte isn't viable that whole time, right? It's viable for probably about 12 to 24 hours, but we still have to move it. The sperm need to meet the ovum sometime during these 4 days and sometime before the oocyte dies off. So preferably early in this process. So the way fertilization occurs is that, right, we went through erection, basically, and ejaculation when we're talking about the male reproductive system. At that point, millions of sperm are being deposited into the vagina. The sperm then have to clear the cervix, get into the uterus, and swim into the uterine tube. So they're doing that, whipping their tails, whipping those flagella. They survive in the reproductive tract possibly about 5 days. They have some protective mechanisms to protect themselves from the environment in the uterus, which is kind of acidic. Only about a few hundred sperm reach the uterine tubes. It's kind of hard to get there. They have to work hard to get there. They have to use a lot of ATP, and the uterus is fighting against them a little bit. Once they're there, though, in order to fertilize the oocyte, they need to undergo something called capacitation. Capacitation basically gives them the capacity to get into the oocyte. So it's happening in the female reproductive tract. Basically what it does is it changes the movement of the tail and changes the movement of the sperm's plasma membrane to allow it to release some enzymes that are going to let it break into the egg, allow it to kind of push through the membrane, and then the egg will undergo its own changes to basically block off additional sperm, because we really only want one sperm fertilizing the egg. Otherwise, things would get genetically dicey pretty quickly. Okay. If fertilization occurs, we then go into pregnancy, which has its own sort of cycles of estrogen, progesterone, as well as some of our other hormones. Okay. First thing is the effect of estrogen. So one of the effects, or let's talk about these as kind of paired effects. So two effects that kind of go together is that estrogen causes duct tissue to grow in the breasts and causes the secretion of prolactin. So these basically prepare the breasts for producing milk. So for lactation, right? So we're basically creating and developing those structures. Estrogen also enhances and grows the ability of smooth muscle in the uterus to contract. So hopefully the uterus is not doing a bunch of contractions while there's a fetus in there, but it needs to be strong enough in order to contract hard enough during birth to get the baby out. So this capacity is basically developing during pregnancy. It's a response to estrogen and partially a response to oxytocin, which it is basically the production of oxytocin is itself a response to estrogen. Okay, so here we see estrogens building up over the course of pregnancy until birth. Fancy word for birth is parturition. Okay, so here we see over the 40 weeks, basically. This is listed in months, but whatever. Okay, the other thing that's going on, progesterone. So progesterone is also aiding growth of glandular tissue in the breasts. It's maintaining the secretory phase uterine conditions. So the secretory phase uterine conditions, I'm going to put way back real quick. Okay, there we go. So the secretory phase of the uterine cycle was to prepare for implantation. So it was to give it a lot of blood supply, to secrete these glycogen-rich fluids, and to close off the cervix, forming this plug. And you want that secretory phase to stay around. You want to keep that glycogen in there to produce energy. You want to keep the cervix plugged. So progesterone is going to allow the uterus to do that. Other thing progesterone is doing is suppressing contractile activity of the smooth muscle of the uterus. So like estrogen is making it so that the uterus will be strong enough to contract during birth, and progesterone is stopping it from actually contracting until birth. So until the progesterone dies off during birth, hopefully that uterus doesn't contract too much. Okay. We also have an important hormone that's being secreted from the placenta called human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. So this is like one of the things I test for in a pregnancy test, right? Is whether this hormone is being secreted from a placenta. HCG sustains the corpus luteum. And remember that the corpus luteum is really what's responsible for secreting a lot of estrogen and progesterone. So here we see HCG from the placenta. You can see that it produces a lot of it early on in pregnancy. So it's producing a lot of it early on in pregnancy, which is allowing the corpus luteum to stick around. And the corpus luteum is producing estrogens and progesterone, and as it sticks around, they just slowly build up, right? The placenta itself, after it produces HCG, then starts to also secrete estrogens and progesterone. So it adds into this effect. And progesterone, this building progesterone, inhibits GnRH, LH, and FSH release. So it's basically prohibiting the things that cause menstrual cycles, right? The things that cause the ovarian cycle, and very specifically preventing the surge in luteinizing hormone that causes ovulation. So here we just have a zoomed in picture of that. And I think we made it through the female reproductive system. I did not think we were going to manage that. Okay. So I will send up an update and survey about the exam and what kind of exam style you want to take, and do the extra credit quiz. Otherwise, have a great summer. Try to go sit in some sunshine someday soon.